Good day, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this first keynote of the 10th edition of Learning Analytics and Knowledge. Our keynote speaker today, Professor Shane Dawson, in my view, has been one of the most influential people in our community, but at the same time, perhaps is one of the least known. I read recently an article describing how keynote speakers are commonly introduced in conferences, mentioning their accomplishments in publications or the institutions in which they work. Fortunately, with Shane Dawson, I don't need to do that. He appears in so many seminal publications in our area that I'm not going to mention any of them. Instead, what I'd like to share with you are other activities that Shane so generously contributed to and that we were equally or more important to the consolidation of our community. Now, if you pay attention, you will see that all these activities combine boundless generosity, a profound sense of service to the community, and perhaps more importantly, a crystal clear strategic vision. And all of these, by the way, with a slight aversion to the spotlight. Shane participated in that first edition of LAK in 2011 in Banff, Canada, where attendees basically identify a common interest and establish the foundation of the learning analytics community. But that first step required a lot of additional work. In the second edition of LAK, this edition was crucial. It was the moment of truth to find out if a year later, that meeting in Banff would go down in history as one of many sparks of research activity that simply fades over time, or if it would be something else. Shane, at the time was at the University of British Columbia in Canada, was instrumental as conference chair. The event was a resounding success. Hosted in a hotel in downtown Vancouver, included a leadership forum, a fantastic reception, and many, many other excellent ideas. It basically set the bar for how the society would approach these events. But not only was an incredibly successful meeting, and not many people know this, Shane's vision was to make these events sustainable. And he managed to guarantee financial support for the following edition of the conference in 2013 in Leuven. I think this 10th edition of LAK is a testament to that vision. In the following years, as editor of the Journal of Learning Analytics, he helped set the structure and regularity required for it to be considered for indexing by the main scientific platforms. Today, I can confirm that his vision has again become a reality. The journal will soon start to be indexed by the major scientific publishing groups. Barely 7 months after that event in Vancouver, I happened to change institutions and move all the way from Spain to Australia. It was November 2012. Shane was the first person to reach out, and true to his generous spirit, he invited me to collaborate in all his research projects. I then realized that he himself also relocated from UBC to Australia. That collaboration hasn't stopped, and it has been one of the most rewarding relationships of my whole career. I remember asking him at that time how Aussies cope with those 28-hour flights to go to the other corner of the world. His answer? Nah. No biggie, mate. You just need a sense of humor. In the last 8 years, he has shaped numerous research initiatives like the use of video annotations or visualization of social networks or provision of personalized feedback, the institutional deployment of data infrastructure, organizing ALASI, and now together with George Siemens, he is at the helm of the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning at the University of South Australia, or UniSA. He has been constantly inviting researchers from all over the world to visit UniSA and promote a wide variety of initiatives. Everybody that has interacted with him can confirm his generosity and passion for the exchange of ideas. Perhaps more relevant to this keynote, he has studied in depth how leadership structures promote the adoption of learning analytics in education and has had a profound effect in UniSA. First as director of the Teaching Innovation Unit, and now as the appointed Executive Dean of UniSA Education Futures. And all this while maintaining one of the strongest track records in the field. How does he do that? I have no idea. I encourage you to ask him. If I had to guess, probably coffee may have something to do with it. Oh, and if you ask him also about his career as National Rugby League player, or his stint as high school teacher, or his work in a farm, or his studies in biology and botanic science. I'm telling you, fascinating fellow. Anyway, jokes aside, I cannot think of anybody better to give a keynote in this 10th edition of LAK and share with us that strategic vision that has underpinned all his career. Ladies and gentlemen, live from the land of under, it is professionally an honor, but personally a privilege to introduce to you Professor Shane Dawson.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and certainly not the manner in which I thought I would be having the honor to talk to you all today, but nevertheless we roll with it. And I think if there's anything around the times that we're in and the message I'd like to give in this keynote, it's around the complexity of this time and how we roll with it. And I think as a community, I'm continually blessed with the colleagues that I work with on a day-to-day. And I think the one thing around learning analytics, which I'll continue to argue, is there's no experts in learning analytics. It always takes a team. And I think of the 200 plus people here today, I think you can all resonate with that in terms of the work that you do. It always takes a team. I wanted to talk today about learning analytics, a field on the verge of relevance. And I think with regards to that, just in case we drop out, there's some key points that I think as a field we need to go into. Is one, we've done very well from conceptualization to predictive models and to innovation around different tools, dashboards and processes. But I think now we need to move very, very purposefully to translation and impact. What is the research saying that has a direct impact on our end users, students and teachers, from K through to higher education through to workplace learning? And to achieve that, I'm going to argue that we need for alternate methodologies that go from micro to macro, or as George keeps trying to convince me to say, is from neuron to neighborhoods. And as a growing community, while we're sort of battling a huge array of complex items at the moment, we need non-stupid optimism. And when I say non-stupid optimism, it's not going into every idea as a great idea, but we need critical thinking. We need healthy skepticism. And that change and that process lies in your hands of the colleagues that are in there today, and I cannot see, but I'm experiencing. Hopefully you're out there. And that's what this dialogue today is about. It's around the spirit of community, which is echoed all the way through LAK, and how we can actually start to collectively enact change. I'll do that by stealing from Lord of the Rings. So we're going to talk about what was, from Banff to Frankfurt, or almost Frankfurt, as I said here, and I can almost taste that Bavarian beer, to move into what is, where are we up to at this point in time in terms of the scale of problems, the issues we've focused on in terms of social and technical divides, and what is yet to be. And that's where I'd like to sort of start to set the platform for the next 10 years of LAK. So in LAK 2031, we're having a different level of conversation around how the field has moved from a process of approaches and methods to a science. The following slides around what was, I'm going to frame in Hefner's research maturity framework here, where Hefner argues that fields develop from a set of environmental pressures, whether they're political, economic and so on, all the way through to we start establishing theories, frameworks and models. And I'll do that as we go through each of the years of LAK, and so we can see how we've progressed over time. We started off in sunny Banff. Actually, it wasn't sunny at all, it was bloody cold. Minus 35 degrees. And if you ever want a conference where everyone stays together, in fact, hugs together and shares the same blanket, you set it up in Banff in a very cold place, and everyone stays together and hugs together. And it formed a community really quickly. I'll say at that time, where we're very, very inexperienced and largely naive about what it would take to establish a society. We had lots of enthusiasm. I think at that time, Javier didn't even have a beard. He was so young. Chris Brooks was still in nappies. So there was a lot of areas there that we could further develop and start to grow. But the best thing about it was that we were all very excited, very collaborative, and there were no egos at all. It was always, from day one, it was very much a team approach, and my hat off to George Siemens for sparking that. So in terms of what was discussed at Banff 11, it really was the defining of the field. It really was looking at how government, financial, areas of trying to cater to diverse cohorts of students in terms of flexibility and technological change shaped what learning analytics was about. And we ended up with a definition there around the collection, collation, analysis and reporting of data about learners and their context for the purposes of understanding and optimizing. I emphasize those two words, understanding and optimizing, was later on, I don't think we're actually doing a good job in optimizing. We're doing a better job in the understanding part, but in terms of actually pushing forward into translation and optimizing the learning context is an area we're significantly lacking. From Banff, we shipped on into Vancouver, which was the greatest conference of all time. We even had a dolphin show. I know, the bench was set exceedingly high, and we had umbrellas and we started a whole array of t-shirts. Effectively though, we did a lot more work on the conceptualization of learning analytics. We did some exploratory works, and we started to see some discussion of new tools and approaches start to come through in the conference proceedings. In Leuven, and I shout out to Eric Deveau, who's still, the late Eric Deveau, who still has a strong association with learning analytics through the scholarship that was established in his name, set up the third Learning Analytics Conference in Leuven. And we can see there our esteemed Professor Pardo, as the current president of SOLAR, has not aged one day. What we saw in that conference was not so much an extension of the works in terms of maturity of what we had, but we really saw an expansion of the regions and interest that was shown in learning analytics, and we started to pick up more industry interest. Obviously, being based in Europe, we had the opportunity to spread and start to build more of a platform in that area around learning analytics research. And we started to see a small range of, broadening of the range of topics and case studies being discussed. In Indianapolis, and here's a word of warning, never ever be prepared to do a talk and walk out and leave your laptop unlocked while George Siemens is in the room, because he jumped up and that was the picture that greeted me as I clicked on my slides to do the first presentation. Thankfully, my talk was about self-citation, and so that was probably a befitting picture at the time. And we can see George Siemens and Dan Southers, who was also an early contributor to SOLAR and its work. So thank you very much, Dan. In Indianapolis, we again saw a little bit more of an expansion in maturity around exploratory works, some very early evaluation studies, and a lot more focus on model development and intelligent tutoring systems was very prominent in that conference. When we shifted into New York, we had strong exploratory works. It was the year of text analysis for that conference. And one of the areas which was great to see was that the attendees and participants and researchers at the time were starting to question where the field was at and what would actually start to advance that field. There was a lot of discussion around the field was strong on analytics. There was little on learning and not much at all related to knowledge, which then when we came into Edinburgh in 2016, Dragan Gasovic as conference chair really led the process then of extending the social dimensions of learning analytics by having keynotes in ethics and privacy as an area. We saw the relationship extended of learning analytics into other fields, and we started to see an increase in leadership and translation of learning analytics. And a shout out to Doug Clow and Rebecca Ferguson for hosting the first Fail-a-thon, which was a great initiative. In Vancouver 2017, I'm sorry, Professor Wise, Alyssa Wise, there were no umbrellas. So it really didn't match the Vancouver 2012 one, but nevertheless, it was a good time for reflections. And again, we saw advances in multimodal works, and again, a call for more replication studies, but no real advancement in the types of work that were being done. No advances into the evaluation into large-scale projects, and definitely very little on, nothing on theory frameworks and models. In Sydney, again, there was a lot of reflections around where the field was at. We had the first learning analytics in schools introduced. Congratulations, Simon Buckingham, Schumann Abelardo for bringing that forward. And there was a greater call for replication studies to really try and settle the field in. Arizona, I think one of the important keynotes that's happened over those years was really Ryan Baker's one, which laid down the challenge for the field in looking at what was termed then colloquially as Baker's Six, which he offered up the ability of $1 US, which on today's exchange rate for Australia is like $1,000 Australian. So it's actually quite attractive now to start to deal with it. But really, Ryan's starting to frame what's part of this talk is where do we really need to go to actually start to see greater impact and generalizability of how our research is playing, and where will it actually make an impact in industry, learners, and the lives of our teachers and so forth in the education system. Which brings us to Frankfurt Online 2020. How far has the field really progressed? Are we still immature? Are we still emergent? We still see those statements still common in learning analytics papers that are coming out. It's an immature and an emergent field. It's a bricolage field. Or can we collectively now say we are making an impact? So where are we at? Has the field of learning analytics research progressed in terms of understanding the learning process and optimizing student success? So a huge shout out to Srečko Joksimovic for helping on this, for leading this work. This is a framework from Dylan and looking at the review of problem statements. And it goes from zero order, very rhetorical questions around trying to identify a space, all the way through to third order where we're looking at correlation and causality. Srečko and colleagues mapped through from 2011 through to 2012 all LAK papers and the problem statements, as well as the Journal of Learning Analytics during that period. And we find that there is a lot of work in relation. We've long worked in that space, but they tend to be small scale studies. To get into conditionality and causality, which is the higher order aspects of that order, we really need to be looking at, they're much more difficult to undertake. And I'll talk about how we can start to address that in a minute. But collectively, the relation aspect of the research we're performing on has been increasing over time. And you can argue there that we are actually maturing, we're actually doing quite a good job in that area. However, I'll counter that with saying we need to start to expand our area of research, and particularly the size. The majority of these published works that we've reviewed are exploratory, and we need a purposeful shift to large-scale evaluation and replication studies. It won't happen by itself. We need to be targeted, and we need it to be strategic. In 2017, Tim McKay in his keynote noted that predictive models built on historical data are only accurate if nothing changes. And he's absolutely correct. But when we're starting to talk about large-scale studies and how we can actually have impact, where do you start? This is a slide just to demonstrate the complexity of dimensions that may start to impact on student outcomes, and this is only a subset. So if this is the complexity of the system, where are we actually changing that would have the most impact on student learning outcomes? So where would we optimize learning in this process? To date, we've been predominantly model focused, and the current models we're producing really fail to account for the complexity of the education system. How are the different agents in our system interacting? And that's the key question that we really need to start to address. So what is yet to be? Now is the time for learning analytics, right now. When we see a substantial shift of every university in the world clambering to go online and clambering to try and get into a space where they can understand learners in that process, now is our time to step up and have a strong voice in how our universities and how our education system offers. And how are we going to support the K-12 sector? Where are we going to focus our attention over the next 10 years? Where's the pivotal areas of research that we really need to focus on that moves us beyond the development of models and moves us beyond the ability just to predict retention aspects in our students and starts to impact on the system at large? And the area to do that is around complexity science. We need to integrate and innovate, as I flagged earlier, from micro to macro, and how we position our field counts. We don't do a good job of positioning where learning analytics plays out in education systems. We need better advocacy at the federal, state, and organizational level in terms of the policy and in terms of the leadership frameworks that we're building here. And I'll walk through some examples over the next, I'm going very fast, so it'll be the next 5 minutes. It's a wee joke. Srečko told me don't do jokes. Sorry, Srečko. Education is one of the most critical determinants of an individual's equality, health, and prosperity. Yet it's also one of the last sectors to innovate through technology. It's very slow to pick things up. It's very complex, yet it's one of the most important elements of a individual's life, how they'll actually work through life, their prosperity and health aspects through life, and it's the equalizer of nations. There isn't any country in the world that wouldn't focus on education as being a critical element of solving complex problems. Anything. From childhood obesity, education will play a strong role with that. Urban planning, processes, transport, and dealing with how we're learning in online at the moment. Education is a critical element of how we will move from the state we're in at the moment, which was looking very, very much like a global recession. It will help move out of this space. Yet at the same time, it's so open to condemnation. Everyone wants to have a swing and a punch at education. So where's the science that can inform and change that perception? Where's the science that will actually come through and say, this is how we make impact? And at present, our social sciences don't do very, very little to change this perspective. We're battling with a whole range of complex elements, and we look at things like Twitter, where we've got everyone has a voice, where there's so much misinformation, where there's an abundance of information. People can find the data that best informs their own biases. It's freely available and everyone has a voice. Unfortunately, it's not the right informed voices that are often guiding these decisions and discussions. Here's what the future of education will look like. Teaching will become an extremely lucrative profession. Salaries will follow a power law. The best teachers will make millions of dollars per year and teach thousands of students per year. That's an interesting perspective. I very, very much doubt that that's going to come to the vogue. Yet it gets, on Twitter, it gets a whole array of discussion going. Another one that's recently come through is the discussion of in-structure and how it's up for sale and the value of student data in that space. And we end up in a binary of two camps, having a discussion around whether or not it's privacy and ethics and it's a breach in the capitalism of student data to advance one entity versus how is student data used and whether or not it actually has that $2 billion value. We should have a voice in that process. The Gates Annual Review noted, in global health, we know that if children receive the measles vaccine, they will be protected against the disease, which means they're more likely to survive. But there's no consensus on cause and effect in education. And again, education, the complexity of education is completely ignored. Right? Clearly, if we had sat down at the start, you cannot treat learning as a cure. You can't give someone one process and that will cure learning. It's the wrong framework to start to have these discussions. And we need a voice that can actually start to change that, where we're starting to see education as a complex system. It's resilient to change. It's adaptive and it has self-organizing clusters. Change is non-linear. It's unexpected. And we need to be able to deal with those uncertainties and processes from the learner level all the way to the higher level organizational aspects. Learning analytics is doing the same process here. We're ignoring the complexity of education. We need methods and approaches that embrace complexity science or systems thinking in order to not only understand the learning, but to optimize that process. We can only understand and optimize from a systems view, and in order to move from a cusp of impact, we really need to rethink our current methods, whether they're applicable, and develop new methods, because it's the only way we'll shift from learning analytics viewed as a method to learning analytics viewed as a science. So let's walk through a quick case study of where we're having impact at the moment. We often have, this is going to resonate, I believe, across we've got a whole array of people from different countries in the world, and this should resonate with most. We often get public criticism, whether that's from industry groups or from the government itself, criticising university graduates are not meeting the demand of the particular area of employment. They're not suited, they're not well equipped with the right attributes and so on. The usual response from government is, okay, we'll have a increasing regulation and we'll have incentivized funding options for meeting performance standards. Now the performance standards then become increasingly complex for universities, so they base them on retention as an indicator of teaching and learning quality and employment rates. We then see that filter down to programs. We then see program directors or coordinators working with teachers and individual courses until we get to the individual student that we're trying to have impact. So where does learning analytics sit in this situation? At this level, we're lucky if we get program level data, Most commonly, the papers and research we undertake comes directly from a teacher, of course, and most commonly from the course that we teach as researchers. We collect that data, we do some analysis, we have a look at the results, develop up our models, and we try and feed back subtle or reactive curriculum changes or provide intervention supports to students and the learner. We are massively missing the complexity of this space, even employment trends, health aspects, where students live and so on. We're missing all that complexity that resides in this area. We need to expand out and look at this whole system, not just the individual parts of the micro level of the student-teacher aspects of learning analytics. Now, this is echoed in the work of Viberg, who recently noted that the results of their review indicated that in only 9% of papers there was an improvement in student learning outcomes. And that's pretty low when you think of the volume of research that's already been undertaken over the past years. Now, the reason it's low is because we're really focused on the minutiae of those elements. We're not looking at a broader aspect. If I take UniSA as an example, we have areas where we would say the biggest predictor of a student's academic performance is their distance they live from the university itself. Okay. Now, looking at that, one aspect would be do more flipped, do more blended learning so students don't have to come on class. But one of the reasons they live far is also a socio-economic disadvantage, which implies they also work, and they work further from the university. And that has different aspects then, how you maintain motivation and consistency and flexibility to be able to provide to those students to address retention or pass for academic performance in these areas. The complexity of the system is ignored. The difference between social and technical aspects is really captured well in Rebecca Ferguson and colleagues' work on where learning analytics has focused on what they termed as the supply side versus the demand side. We termed this as more the technical aspects of learning analytics and also the social spaces of learning analytics. And we're seeing lots of work in the technical, but very little in the social spaces. We're seeing learning analytics predominantly situate learning in a linear and fixed model, yet we all know that learning is not linear nor fixed. So we need to study the interaction dynamics that reside in that system, but that aspect is the social system. And that's where it becomes complex. It's harder to capture data. It's harder to undertake studies in that space. So we tend to focus on the more simplified elements of the technical aspect, where we can build a tool, we can establish a model, we can look at quantitative data in its raw form to establish predictive models and so forth. The failure to undertake and look at that complexity means we're really creating innovative solutions but no problem to go with it. We don't fully understand the complexity of the problem to provide an adequate solution. And I like Glasberg, and it was a very funny joke. I can hear you all laughing quietly all around the world at this present point in time, and it brings me great warmth. I'll just add that. Again, so where's the literature that we're currently drawing on? And again, led by our esteemed Srečko Joksimovic, looked at where learning analytics from LAK and JLA papers drawing their citing, where the literature is they're citing. And we can see 3 to 4 main areas there. So we've got computer science as being the dominant area that we're drawing our literature from, our ideas from, education or social science, and psychology. Math is another area that's growing, and engineering in terms of AI is also a growing area that's popping up there. It's a long tail of other areas, but we are starting to see where it's being adopted into more applied spaces. And it's captured well in Srečko's Sankey diagram, which looks hideously ugly here, but there is a nice link where you can go and see this and access yourself and have a play around with the data. We've seen since 2011 that computer science has been a consistent stream on its own, being cited within the LAK literature. In the social sciences space and psychology space, we saw them come together and separate out, but now we're seeing more defined elements of psychology and social sciences as the second and third stream in 2019 following through. The bottom 2 streams there I don't see colours, so hopefully people are following on what I'm saying. But the bottom two streams there, we're starting to see emerge are more in the applied areas, and we're starting to see again a little pickup where learning analytics is being adopted into areas like dentistry or nursing and so on. The danger in this process, though, is while we're trying to advocate for a richer diversity of literature being involved in learning analytics, the danger that is that we too much diversify and we become too distributed rather than target and purposeful. And we saw in the paper by Nunes looked at what happened to cognitive science is that we need intentional bridge building so that we don't end up as either a singular entity where it's dominated by one group or too diverse where there is no real strong voice or targeted aspect here. So we need intentional bridge building to specific disciplines, not focused on one domain, but equal contributors that run across a range of fields and dimensions. I think the area we really need to be focusing on is around complexity science. Now, complexity science is an area that's going to provide a whole range of new methodologies that we can certainly expand on, and certainly we can start to innovate in to establish a new approach for learning analytics. I like the framework that, just out of that paper that Michael Jacobson, Manu Kapoor and Peter Ryman pulled together is that here's a subset of it, is that it tries to articulate how complexity science could look at it in education in two levels, either as agents or elements in a system where we actually see the aggregation of those agents coming together, for example, as students at play. But we also have studies in how individual agents behave. And so we actually have a broader range of methods and approaches that could be adopted in that space to understand the full complexity of education and the learning processes. We also have, by Rowan and a list of 10,000 other colleagues, in looking at areas like machine behavior. And I think this is a fascinating paper that was established here in looking at the way that machines might start to behave, but also the associated methodologies on how we can start to examine that. And I think this is a really interesting process by which we're seeing the aggregation of different fields come together that were not previously linked, where we have, in this case, AI and ethnography or ethology, where we're looking at the behavior of different entities. It does bring a very novel approach to start to study different dynamics in systems and different approaches in learning. We're starting to see again through David William Schaefer and others around the quantified ethnography, again as an interesting area that's starting to get more and more foundations. These are areas that we need to build on and link with in a purposeful direction so that we can establish new approaches. So where to? What's our action? Everyone loves a good action step. So I challenge you all, and that's the purpose of a good keynote, is in the first kickoff, is while you're going through and looking at all the vast array of papers there, is to identify areas you can build on individually and we can build on collectively as a group. We need to integrate and innovate. We need to integrate with new disciplines, consolidate with our established disciplines, and innovate our approaches and methods. We need new ways of examining learning data. We need new ways of examining how those systems interact, and we need new ways of being able to research the adoption and uptake of learning analytics at an organizational level, from micro to macro. It's the only way we will start to get into this space, where we can have what Hefner described as the more mature elements of a field, where we're undertaking evaluative research, large-scale projects, collaborative large-scale projects, and is building on new theories, new frameworks, and new models. One of the areas I spoke about early was how we position the field. So stop it. I'm going to say these are three elements that make me cranky. Okay, let's stop referring to students as customers. They're not. There isn't a shop in the world that evaluates their customer and says, I'm sorry, you failed to hand over your credit card and I'm going to fail you on this process. You can't have this good, right? We don't do it. And when we evaluate or when we compare our students with customers, when we talk in that manner, you're building on a whole array of terminology and frameworks that come from business. That's the framework you're picking up, and that's the process that gets spread into policy and advocacy and all the way through. So don't do it. They're students. That's it. They're learners. Medicine. Precision medicine. Don't do it. There is no such thing as precision education. You cannot cure learning. I'm sorry, you can't stab someone with at this stage with a vaccine that cures stupidity. You cannot do it. So stop doing it. Let's establish our own position. We don't have to borrow the terminology of others and reduce ourselves to a process where we have, one of the wealthiest people in the world referring and saying, why can't we cure education the same way we cure measles? Right? We need to frame ourselves in a better way, and learning engineering is just a term I don't like, so I've added it to there as well. Don't do it. We can position ourselves better as a field in using our own frameworks and processes and our own terminology to be able to take us forward. So where do we go? This is a framework that was established within C3L, where we're looking at artificial cognition and human cognition as elements. This is a very simple process where on the outer rims of this you have very hardcore AI research, and on the other side we have neuroscience and other elements in the cognitive research domain. As these spheres overlap, that's the research intersection where learning analytics is becoming critical. Now, I'll talk about this not necessarily in the way that George and others are framing the human-artificial cognition nexus in terms of how humans increasingly utilize AI tools or machine learning or other agents, technical agents, but more so in how this actually changes the policy and advocacy approach as we increasingly have educational technologies come into the education space. We've seen the growth of EdTech and analytics products. Higher education now, the growth of educational technologies and startups was predominantly a few years ago in the higher education space. The growth now is in the K-12 sector. It is outpacing higher education in terms of educational technology adoption. And it will very, very shortly be a $1 trillion industry. Well, when I added that slide, that was before COVID-19, so maybe we might want to temper that a little bit as we go forward now. But think about it, who's making the policy decisions in the way we're increasingly adopting educational technologies in education? Okay? We increasingly have third-party entities that governments are outsourcing to that control the way that educational technologies are not only supported and developed, but how they're enacted, how they're rolled out into education, how our data is analysed. That whole agency is being moved out to a third party. The decreased elements of government expenditure in this space has also meant that the commercial entity itself is not necessarily aligned to the purposes of a public system. Commercial companies don't necessarily have the same values and the same vision as a public good where education sits. Their interests are not necessarily aligned. So we have an incompatibility here that we need to address. Rose Luckin noted in a paper where through the implementation of common data standards and data sharing requirements, AI will be able to provide an analysis of about teaching and learning at every level, whether this is a particular subject, class, college, district, or country. There's nothing wrong with what Rose has flagged, yet if it's outsourced to a third-party element, who is actually making the decisions around how the data is being used to identify where learning resources can be most appropriately allocated? It would be the goal of every education system to be able to appropriately allocate resources in a fiscally minded way, but also in the most effective and the most efficient way. But who is making that decision when you're outsourcing this to a third party? For every tool and technology that is being deployed in a classroom or is being adopted at an organization or is unfortunately being pushed out towards a government in terms of outsourcing, whether it's testing or data collection, analysis and modeling, who's making the decisions? There is a transference of agency and power at every level of the education system. So in a classroom, when your K-12 teacher is sitting there teaching your child to read and hands over an iPad with an app on it, and that app makes a recommendation to that student, who now has the power, who has agency in that classroom. And they're questions that we really need to we need to tackle as a collective, as a learning analytics field. It'll spark a whole array of questions around algorithmic bias, algorithmic trust that learners, teachers, and organizations need to be able to address. We need to focus on our leadership and advocacy. As I flagged at the start, in 2011, it was a very naive, enthusiastic, but lovely group of people that have come forward, and I'll gladly say most of them are now in Australia. We're still trying to get a few others over here, Hendrik, Chris Brooks, others, Nia Dell, to come to Australia, but it was a great group of people that came together. And in those early years, the whole intention was to build the field where we focused on students and early career researchers to build the field. And we've done that. We've developed lots of leadership opportunities where people who are at that first conference are now in leadership positions. How are we developing those leaders to have now policy voices? Because they're increasingly interacting with government officials, education ministers, university leaders, vice chancellors, school principals. How do we ensure that they have advocacy and a weight of a whole field behind them to help develop and be practiced enough to make the right choices and decisions as they go forward? We need developmental leadership opportunities now that spanned by the society, that spanned not only early career, but all the way through to mid-career and senior career. And George asked me to have one global super professor. So there can only be one apparently. We could do this as well by having lots of industry engagement and internships. From day one, Civitas Learning which is now a very successful company built on learning analytics work, was with, I believe they're at BAMP, but definitely the first solar flare that was established at Purdue with John Campbell. We've seen these companies now grow and leverage off the great work that's been done in research around learning analytics. How do we have a space in that so we have people who understand the full aspects around learning analytics and what can be done in terms of system dynamics? Moving forward, we need to establish systems that will enable change, not individual solutions. We need a process where we can only do this as a collective, where we stop looking at the current processes of developing new models. The research we're undertaking is good. It's not great yet. It will be great when we make our new, it will be great when we pave our own roads, when we're establishing new fields, new opportunities, new questions and new methods. That's when we become great. That's when we become a science. And we will do that all together as a community. And we can do all that now through the process of this conference, where we're all starting to integrate, learn from one another and establish the connections that will take us forward into the next 10 years. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time and effort, and a huge shout out to the conference organisers in these complex times. To be able to pull this off in a changing circumstances, you've done an absolute magic job. I'll circle back and thank Abelardo for the welcome and the introduction, and just again emphasize it's certainly a team approach, and nothing that you noted I did was certainly without a whole array of other colleagues, and so I still learn from those colleagues and I still learn from new colleagues in the field. Thank you very much.